Hello and welcome to Codified Lounge. My name is Gaurang and today we are going to continue our discussion on CSS and talk about box model. For anyone new to the channel, this video is part of the Web Development Fundamental series, and if you want to watch all the videos from the beginning, the link to the playlist is in the description. And so without any further delays, let's get started. So before we look at box model, let's take a look at a couple of HTML elements, right? So we have here boilerplate HTML code, right? We have a title, CSS basics. We have also linked a style sheet, which right now is empty. We haven't added any styles yet. And we have a heading level 1 tag called CSS basic. And when we run it, it looks like this, right? We have nothing else, just a heading tag called CSS basic. Now let's go ahead and add a couple of elements to it. So let's say I add a heading level 2. I say I am a H2 and I'll add a span and I'll say I am a span. So when you open it in the browser, visually these two elements, they look similar other than the font size and font family differences, right? Let's open our developer tools by right clicking and click on inspect, right? And we'll use this element selector like the first icon over here, this guy. We'll use this element selector and select our heading 2 element. Now what you see here is the browser tells us that this heading 2 element is in a rectangular shape. If you see, it shows a rectangular border over the element, and it says that this element takes up the width of the page, right? If you see, the border goes from one end of the page to the second end. Similarly, if we select the span element, it's a little bit different. It's still rectangular, it's like a box, but it doesn't take the whole width of the page. Now why is that? Let's take a couple of more examples, right? So here let's create a paragraph and say I am a paragraph. Here let's take a anchor tag. I am a link, https example.com. Right, so we gave it an href. Now if we look at the page, so if you see, we have a paragraph here, we have our span, and we have our link. Now you will see some more differences. Let's select paragraph again. Again, paragraph is a rectangular box which takes up the whole width of the page. If you go over link, the link is also a rectangular box, but it doesn't take up the whole page. Another difference here is when you create a paragraph, it created the paragraph in a new line, versus the link, it just created next to the span, right? We can reproduce this by saying, okay, let me create another paragraph, right? And we'll create another link. I am second link, right? If we go back to our page, again, you see each paragraph is in a new line and each link is in the same line. So what's happening here is the browser is dividing our elements into two different categories, right? And those categories are block level elements and inline elements. So how do we differentiate between these two elements, right? So let's take a quick look here. So basically, a block level element, it always starts in a new line. So if you see our example here, when we added a second paragraph after our first paragraph, it started in a new line. Right, it didn't continue immediately when the first paragraph ended. Right. Second identifier is the block level element always takes up the full width available. Again, if you see our example, both the paragraph, even though the length of the paragraph is short, it takes up the full width available of the page. Right, it takes the 100% of the width available. Similarly, inline elements, they never start in a new line. So again, if you see our example, after a span is an inline element. So after span, we went to a link, we created a link and we created a second link. All three of them, they rendered one after the other in the same line, right? And the second difference is inline elements only take up as much width as necessary. They do not take up all the width required. So again, like you see, if you hover over inline element, the browser developer tool shows us that okay, it only takes, like the blue shading tells us that it only takes the width of the width that is required for this text to render. If you hover over a paragraph, it says even though paragraph is this much, it will take up the whole width of the page, right? It's important to understand this because going forward, when you are rendering elements, you would want to know why certain elements are behaving differently, right? And that's why it could be that these elements are block elements and certain elements are inline elements, and then you might want to change the styling so that they render as you wanted. You might want all the elements to render in next to each other, let's say, right? So one of the property that manages that is the width. So for block elements, like I said, by default it takes the 100% width of the element. But let's say if I go back to the editor here, right, and I add a style and I say width, I say let's say 500 px. Let's do it in pixel right now, right? Now if you go back to our page, it doesn't change how it renders, but if we hover over it, now if you see, our paragraph is just the 50% of, well, it's not 50%, it's just 500 pixels wide, but the second paragraph is still 100 whatever the width of the page, right? So you understanding whether the element is a block or inline will help you organize your web page better in future. So now let's see how do these block level elements and inline elements behave when we have multi-line elements. So let's go to Lorem Ipsum generator, right? We will generate a paragraph, and what we'll do is we'll copy the same paragraph in a block level element, and then we'll copy the same paragraph in a inline element. So let's take a paragraph which is a block level element, copy it over here, and then let's create a span which is an inline element, copy it over here, right? Now if we look at our page, okay, visually it doesn't make too much difference, right? You just see there are two paragraphs, they look more or less the same, right? So what's the difference here? Let's do this. Let's add a background color to both. Let's go back to the page, and now you can see some difference, right? So let me zoom in. So now if you see a block level element, it's treating this whole block of text as a single entity, as a single block, right? But if you see the inline element, you'll see there is this gap in between each line, right? So inline element, it's treating as if the element continued for one line and then it overflow in each line, right? If you see here, there is this white line between each lines, but for block level elements there is no line. So it's important to remember the difference of how multi-line content is rendered in block element versus in inline elements, because it also affects how box model works for block element and inline element, right? So let's go forward and look at CSS box model. So if you see, right, when we hover, when we select an element, we see that the browser treats each element as a rectangular box, right? It doesn't matter if it's a block level element or an inline element, each element is treated as a rectangular box. This is also true for any element that you might see as a circle, right? Browser still treats that as a rectangular box. And what the browser does is it has divided each box into four different parts, which combined creates this box model for CSS. Right, so let's go to the whiteboard and look at these four different parts. Let's say we have this text called hello. Now this text could be a part of a div tag or a heading tag or an anchor tag or a paragraph tag. It doesn't matter. For now, let's just say we have this content called hello. Right, now in order to understand CSS box model, think of the analogy where we are treating each element as a box, as a moving box. right? So in each moving box, we have some content. We have the box itself. So this is the main content of that box. So the first part of the CSS box model is the content area, and let's represent that by this yellow highlighted. So this is the actual stuff. If you are moving from one home to the other, think of this as, let's say you are moving books. So the content represents the actual books inside a box, right? Next part of the CSS box model is the padding. As the name suggests, padding is the area that is between the edge of the content and the border of the box. So again, if you are transporting, let's say, something breakable, like some glass items, you want to add padding, right? You add clothes padding or a sponge padding around it. So it's not the actual stuff you're moving, it's not the edge of the box, it's something that you put between your content and the edge of the box, right? Next is the border area. So that we are going to represent it by red line over here. So this border area, basically it extends the padding, like it continues from the edge of the element and increases from there. So basically, think if you are using a cardboard box, it has a thin edge, thin border. Let's say you are using a wooden crate, it might have a thicker border, right? So border area is like the thickness, which is represented by the thickness of your border of the content, right? And finally we have this margin area. Right? This margin area basically represents the area between the border and the next box, the next element. So area between the two borders of two elements, right? So let's say we have another content over here. Oops. Let's clear that. Let's say we have another content over here, and this is its border, right? Then this green stuff, it's the padding, it's the margin between those two elements, right? Let's look at this in a more practical example, and we can actually visualize the whole CSS box model. But all these four areas, it creates our box for this element, and this represents the CSS box model, and we can then tweak different CSS attributes to change different parts of this box model, and we'll try and do that next. So we are going to add a new h2 just to differentiate between everything, and we are just going to say CSS box model, right? We'll add a div tag. We'll say class, and we'll say CSS box model, and here we'll add a paragraph. This is a paragraph inside a div. Okay, let's just check how it looks. Okay, we have the box model over here. Let me zoom in a bit. So let's start with the innermost area. So as from our diagram, let's start with the content area. So if you open your developer tools and select the element, here the blue area represents the content area. So like we are using a paragraph over here. Paragraph is a block level element. Block level element takes up 100% of the available width. So the content area is 100%. And now the content area can be controlled using CSS attribute called width, right? So let's go to our CSS, right? And we'll just add style saying, let's keep it simple. Let's add another class here instead of playing with CSS selectors right now. Box model para, right? And we are just going to say dot CSS box model para, and we'll say width 50%, right? So what we are saying here is that set the width to 50% of the parent element. In this case, parent element is again div, which is again 100% of width. So it basically sets the width to 50% of the available width. So now if you go to the browser, now if you hover over it, if you see the blue area, it got decreased to 50%. Right? To make this more clear, let's do this. Let's also add a background color and say background color yellow. Right? And to further help visualize, let's also add CSS Box Model. Right? In the div, let's add background color red. Now if we see, go back here, if you see this, our content area is now 50%, which is yellow in color, which has the background yellow in color, and a div which is 100%, which has the background red in color. So half of the div is behind the yellow color, half of the div is outside it. So we only say the later half of it, right? To further, we'll be able to further visualize this once we again add other elements of the box model. So what can we do next? Next, let's add padding, right? The orange part over here. So if you remember, padding area basically extends the content area, right, to the border area. So it's the area between the edge of the content and the border. So let's try and increase that. So for our paragraph, the way you can do that is you can say padding, and let's say add padding top 10 pixel. So we added padding 10 pixel to the top part of the content. So now if you see here, the padding to the top has increased to 10 pixel. It has more gap on the top. So this area is the area between the edge of the content and edge of the border. So that increased to 10 pixel. We can further increase that. Let's say we can say, okay, I also want padding on the bottom. Padding bottom 10 pixel. We go back here. You'll see there's a 10 pixel increase in the padding over here. We can also see it real time. Let's use our developer tools. So if you remember last time we had seen in our developer tools, we see all our classes over here, all our styles over here. So we can do that over here. So here, if I select padding top, okay, let me disable my camera for a second. Yeah. If you select padding top, you see it's 10 pixel, right? And that we can increase it. And if you see our box model, it will slowly start to move. This is because we are adding more and more padding on the top. Right? Same way we can do it with padding bottom. Right? So again, we are extending the area between edge of the content and the border of the element. Right? These changes are not permanent. So if I refresh the page, they reset back to 10. So to make it permanent, let's go over here and let's do that 20, 20. So we added padding top, padding bottom. We can also do padding left, and we can say 10px. We can do padding right, and we can say 20px. Let's see, or let's just match them. 20px, right? If you see over here, our paragraph has left padding of 10px, which you can again see it in action by over here in the developer tools. If you increase and decrease, the text will, like the content will move because we are increasing the gap between the content and the border, right? There is also a shortcut to do that. So we are adding padding in 4 different lines here. So there is also a shorthand for that. Let's comment this out, and we can say padding, and we can just say 20px. So what this does is it adds a 20 pixel padding to all four sides, padding top, right, bottom and left. It adds a 20 pixel padding everywhere. So if you go back over here, if you see, this is 20 pixel. Now if I decrease this, all four padding decreases and it starts moving back, right? Again, like I said, this change is not permanent. If I refresh, it sets to whatever we had in the file. There is also another shorthand where you can do padding all four in one line. So you can say padding 10, 10, 10, 10, or let's say you want this. Oops, not 1tpx, 15px. 15px. So what does this do is the first value is the top padding, right padding, bottom padding and left padding. Right, so it sets all these four values. So now if you see here, if you open this, padding top is 10 pixel, padding right is 15 pixel, which you can again increase and decrease over here. Padding bottom is 10 pixel, right, and padding left is 10 pixel. So now if I change here, let's say I do this, it will only change the 10 pixels. So you can set all the values in one line like this. Or you can have padding top, padding left, all four values in different specific attributes. Another shorthand is you can just do two of them. You can just say 10 and 15, and the browser still interprets as top and bottom are 10. So first value represents top and bottom, and second value represents right, left and right. So now if you go back to the browser, if you see this, padding top and bottom are 10, padding right and left are 15, and it still looks the same. So there are different shorthands to represent that. We are using pixels here. There are other unit, px is pixel over here. There are other units for this. We'll cover the units specifically in a different video. There are more details to it, what are the best practices and everything, right? So this is padding, which represents the area between edge of the content to the border. Next, let's add border. So let's say border, and we'll say, let's say 1 pixel, right? Let's say border type, border style, and we'll say solid, right? And border color, let's say red, right? Now if you go here, you'll see there is a red border around our paragraph tag, right? Let's change this color to maybe green so that it's visible. Okay. If you see, as paragraph starts from here, ends it over here, so there is a green border around our paragraph. We can, let me change the color here. It will be more visible if I do this. Let's increase the width to 10 pixels. Now if you go here, there you go. Now you see there is a green border around it, right? You can increase the border width, and if you see the element width, it does not change, or element height does not change. The padding width and padding height does not change. All it changes is the border width and height. So it's expanding outwards, not inwards. If you see, everything else stays the same. Same way, now if you change the padding, let's say I'm changing top and bottom padding. Again, the element, like the content height width doesn't change, just the area between the content and the border is changing, right? And the border height and width are not changing, just the area between those two. So the padding, so now you see there's the difference between different areas in our CSS box model, right? What else? Yeah, even the border has similar shorthand. You can do border green solid, right? You can have all the border attributes in just one line if you want. If you go back, it still stays the same because we just basically copy pasted the values. Now let's define the next one, the green area outside it. It's the margin. So like I said, the margin is the area between two HTML elements. So for that, let's add another paragraph here. So now you can see there are like two paragraphs over here, right? This is the first paragraph, this is the second paragraph. We have the same classes over there, CSS Box Model para, so it's the same styles. I'll just add another class over here, second para, right? And I'll just, let's add our margin to the second para, right? Again, margin can be controlled by an attribute called margin, CSS attribute called margin. So I can add margin top and I'll say 10 pixel. Right, let's just see what happens. So if you go back here, doesn't look there's too much of a difference, and the reason is sometimes the browser, they have their own default styles. So for certain elements, the browser would go ahead and add margin by default, which in this case is 10 pixel. There's 16 pixel margin, right? So therefore 10 doesn't take. So now if we increase the margin, the moment it crosses 16, we start seeing the difference. So now if you see, the content height and width are not changing. The what do we say? The padding height and width are not changing. The border stays the same. Just the distance between these two content is increasing. Why? Because we are adding margin top to the second element, right? Interesting thing to see is the margin is basically the total distance between these two, between the heights of these two, right? Between the edges of these two. So if I go ahead in the first element and I add margin bottom, and let's say add 20 pixel, nothing will happen. Why? Because the distance between these two elements is already more than 20 pixel. And if I keep going till, I think 70 something, if I keep going till 70, yeah, only after that it started adding margin. So let's say I did margin 90px over here. Now if I go back to the second element, if I start increasing margin over here, nothing will change because the distance between these two elements is already more than that. Now it reached 90. Now if I do 91, it will start moving. See? So basically the margin defines the area between edges of two elements, but this was margin top. So what happens? Let me refresh. Okay. What happens if I do margin left? Let's do 10 pixels. So in this case, there are no elements to the left of this, but if you see, it moved, the element itself moved a little bit to the left because it added a gap between edge of the outer edge of this element and whatever there was on the left side. So if, in this case there is this edge of div. If there is not div, then we are in the body element, right? So it will add 10 pixel between the border of the body element and the border of our paragraph element. So because I added in second para, it's just added to the second one. So if I increase the margin, it will just keep moving this, right? Same way, we can also do margin right. This is similar to padding. Okay, so we did margin right 10px. But if you come here and see, there is no difference over here. And the reason is the width. Since the width is limited to 50%, and because of that, the gap between the right edge and the element is more than 10 pixel, right? So if we remove the width, now if you see, there is a margin right of 10 pixel. If I increase that, the element width is decreasing because we have set the margin left to 10 pixels, so element cannot go more than 10 pixel on the right, on the left, and the margin right is we are increasing to 175 pixel. So in order to do that, the element width needs to decrease. But this is not the right way to set the element width. If you want to set the element width, it's better that you set it to 50% rather than setting margins. Ideally, you want to use margins only to move and add gaps between two elements and not setting the width. Right? Margin bottom, let's add 10 pixel. Right? So When you come back to the page, we see that the margin bottom 10 pixel doesn't work. Right? Even if I try to increase it, it doesn't increase. And the reason is because of something called margin collapsing. So what happens in nested elements is sometimes the browser, they collapse the margin. That means they combine the margin of two elements under certain condition. One of the condition is if there is no separation between the parent element and the child element, it collapses the margin, and so the child element margin, it gets treated as the parent element margin. So how can we check that, right? Oops. Let's go to the element. Let's select this. Let me see if I can go down. And if you hover over it, you see the orange highlighted portion outside the red box. That's our margin, right? So let me do this. Let me bring this to the right so it could be easier to see. Now, if I increase the margin over here for the second para, you see it's increasing the margin area outside the red box because it has collapsed the margin of the the outer div and the inner para, right? So it's increasing the margin, so it's not behaving as expected. It's not increasing the area between the para and the edge, but it's increasing the area between the bottom of the page and the div page. So how do we fix that? Like I said, one of the reason this happens is there is no content separation between those two, right? So we can introduce that. Let's go back to the div. Let's go back to our this thing, and let's just say I just want a padding of, let's say 1 pixel. We'll add a padding of 1 pixel, which will separate all the content over here. Now, if you see, there is a gap between these two. Now, if I increase our margin, now it's behaving as well. The margin bottom is behaving as expected now. And that's also true for margin top. Let's see, for the first para, if I remove the padding, if I remove this, right, and go back, let's use the browser developer tools. If I select this, and if I say, hey, for this guy, add margin top to be 10 pixel, nothing happens. And if you see, it's increasing the gap between the whole div tag and the h2 heading that we have over there, right? We don't want that. What we want is, we want the paragraph to move down inside the div. So we just add the padding back, go back here, and now if we add margin top 10 pixel, now we'll see the desired effect. So this is something called margin collapsing. It's a scenario that you need to be careful of while adding all these scenarios. If your CSS is not behaving as expected, make sure you are following these conditions. So if you remember, when I first started the CSS intro to CSS, I had showed you this GIF regarding Peter Griffin struggling with CSS, and now you'll start seeing the effect of that. Like even something as simple as adding margin can have multiple conditions depending on how you are organizing your elements and what are the cascading styles that are getting to that are being applied to it. So sometimes it can be as frustrating as just opening a blind, right? So this was CSS box model on block elements. We were using div, we were using paragraph. Everything is a block element. Now let's see what happens if we add the CSS box model to inline elements. So what we are going to do is we'll go back to this thing. Let's create another div class. Div. I can type, right? Let's add the same class name. And instead of a paragraph, let's add a span, which is an inline element. This is a span inside div, right? We'll add a new class here, CSS Box Model span. right? Let's go back to our page and span inside. Okay, let's add some margin to this. Margin bottom 20 pixels so that it's a little bit different. Okay, it's separate from this, right? So this is a span inside div. As expected, nothing specific. Let's add background to this color so we can visually separate them, right? So since it's an inline element, you'll see the difference that okay, its content width is same as the content width is not 100% of the page. It is as much as needed. It matches the length of the content in this case, right? So that's the content area. Let's add padding to it. So now that the syntax to add the CSS styles is always the same, but let's add padding left 10 pixel and padding right 10 pixel. And if you go here, as expected, okay, there is padding left and padding right. Let's also add padding top 10 pixel, padding bottom 10 pixel, right? Little bit different from expectation, right? It's not behaving as our block element, but the padding, it overlaps the parent element, so it looks different, and it's not a bug or issue. It is based on the specs. Basically, W3C for some reason decided that for inline elements you cannot add padding top or bottom. I mean, you can add those, but it will not it will not move other elements around it. So that's why, because we have a background color, if you remove the background color, you see padding left will have some effect in this, padding right will have some effect in this, not in this case, but it has some effect on that, but padding top and bottom will not have any effect on the element. That it does not displace the element, it does not displace move any surrounding elements, it just doesn't have any effect on it, right? So it is based on the specs. If we want to add padding to an inline element, you have another property called display, where you can set the element as inline block, and then you can add padding top and bottom to it, right? So that is padding. Again, this is something that you'll start realizing now as you go forward. So next, let's add border to this. So we are just going to copy the border from our block level element example, paste it over here, and if we go back to our view, and you'll see we have the border. It looks almost as similar as the block level element. Right? Again, only difference is because it's inline element, it went over the parent component because of padding. So I can just do this and maybe reduce the border size, make it look a little bit better. Yeah. So that's the border. Again, all the shorthands that we see over here that we added to our block level elements for border are applicable over here. You can split it into 3 different attribute styles and they still work, right? Next, for margin, let's add another span tag. Right, this is second span inside div. Let's quickly take a look. Since it's an inline element, it should render next to each other as expected, right? They do not, inline element never render in different lines. They only take up the space they need. So now let's add margin left 10 pixel and margin right 10 pixel. If you open the web view again, and we see that, okay, now there is a gap between these two. There is more gap on the left of the page, more gap over here. That is because of the margin. So we can also test this theory out. Oops. If I increase margin left, you'll see that our elements are slowly moving to the left, right? Another interesting thing to see over here is, because of the zoom level and because of the window width right now, our text is overflowing in the second line, right? And because of the way the specs were designed, the inline element does not displace any other elements on the top or bottom of the inline element. It is overflowing it on top of it. So the second span, the text it went to the second line, and it's because of its padding and all, it's kind of overriding the text on the first line, right? Again, this is the expected behavior. This is by design, and that's why whenever you are designing your web page, you need to think about what kind of elements you want to use and what kind of styles do you want to apply for these, right? So margin left and right. Another interesting thing you might see is, let's do this. Let's add margin top, right? And add 10 pixel. Margin bottom, 10 pixel. Right, we should expect margin top and bottom to be applied, but it doesn't seem to be the case. If we increase the margin, nothing. If we increase the bottom margin, nothing. Right? Again, this is not an issue. This is not a bug in the system. This is by design. CSS specs, which I have linked in the description, they say that margin top and margin bottom should not have any effect on inline elements. I tried to research a lot to understand why they decided that, but I couldn't find anything. If you know why this call was made, please comment on this video so that we can all learn from it. But that's it, margin top and bottom do not have any effect on your inline element box model. So that's CSS box model for you. We saw how it works in a block level element. We saw how it works in an inline element. And finally, you would be thinking, how do we visualize it? Do we have to add background colors, these ugly colors every time? Do we want to visualize it? The answer is no. Luckily, most modern browsers, let me bring this to the bottom again. Most modern browsers, they come up with this tool. So if you go to developer tool, and if you go to styles, let me move this a little bit to the left. Yeah, if you go to the styles, right, most modern browsers, they show you the box model for each of the element. So let's go to H1, right? So they show, okay, the content dimension are this, width is 619, height is 36, right? There is no padding, there is no border, there is a 21.44 pixel margin above and below that. Let's go to H2, something similar. Let's go to our paragraph. Okay, let's go here, CSS box model. So CSS box model, this is the outer div. There is no margin, there is no padding, there is no border. There is a padding of 1 pixel that we added, right, to fix the margin collapsing, and the content area is 617 pixel by 159 pixel, right? And similarly, there is a margin of 20 pixel, margin bottom of 20 pixel that we added. If we go inside it, if we click the paragraph, right, this is the CSS box model paragraph that we added. Again, you can see, okay, there is a margin of 16 pixel above and below, right, top and bottom. No margin on the left, no margin on the right. There is border of 10 pixel all around, right? There is padding of 10 on the top and bottom and 15 on the right, and overall content area is 308 by 18. So you don't have to add these ugly background colors every time you want to look at elements box model on how it's rendering. You can just look at this. So whenever you see, hey, this element is not behaving as expected, why is it rendering in this weird way, you can go to developer tools, go to styles, check out the box model to see what styles are applied to it, right? Because sometimes there could be some user agent style sheet that you are not aware of it, but this box model will always show you what style sheets are applied to that particular element, right? And that will help you in debugging many issues and makes it easier to design web pages. So that is it for today. That was block level elements, inline elements, and CSS box model. I really hope that was really helpful to you. I really hope that you guys learned something, and I really hope it wasn't a frustrating experience like it was for Peter Griffin, and I hope it simplifies your web development going forward. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or join my Discord and ask over there. I am very active on my Discord. I'll try to answer any questions that you have, and I really hope I see you in the next video. Till then, adios, take care and stay safe. Peace.